Katori Yusei is a 20-year-old office worker who is a bit of a workaholic. One night, when she returns home after working overtime, she suddenly sees a flash of light and is summoned to a royal palace in another world as a saint. However, a prince appears, absorbed in another girl, Era, who has also been summoned, and the neglected Sei has more time than she knows what to do with. At that time, Jude, a young man Sei meets in the grounds of the royal palace, shows her around the Institute of Medicinal Plants. Sei, who was already a plant lover and interested in research institutions, works there as a researcher, but demonstrates unexpected abilities in making potions using medicinal herbs and magic. She grasps the technique very quickly and even produces more than the Institute can handle. Her potion is requested when the Third Order of Knights returns from an expedition wounded by a fire-breathing lizard known as a salamander. Sei and her allies begin to heal the knights. The greatest miracle performed by Sei is saving the commander of the Third Order of Knights with her potions. Johan is grateful but also reports to his superior that she may be a saint. However, it is too early to tell. With additional funding from the palace, Johan is able to provide a kitchen. When Sei cooks, the staff love the food she makes, especially since she uses medicinal herbs. She officially meets Albert Hawk, who offers to take her and a few others to the southern woods to obtain ingredients for a powerful potion. As Sei starts working without glasses, the rest of the staff fall in love with her cooking. Sei goes to the palace library where she meets Elizabeth Ashley. Albert begins to take Sei to the library regularly. During one of these visits, Elizabeth asks for a favor for her friend, Nicole Adler. Sei happily provides some lotion for Nicole's acne, and she is grateful. News of these cosmetics spreads throughout the kingdom. Elizabeth then teases Sei about her budding romance with Albert, called Ice Knight. To escape the heat, Sei brings cold water to soak her feet. Jude helps her cool down but reminds her not to show anyone her barefoot. He also tells her that there are hardly any ice wizards in the kingdom. Albert accidentally sees Sei's feet when he comes to visit her. After apologizing, he asks her to come to the city with him the next day. They travel through the city by carriage. Albert helps Sei get out of the carriage and grabs her hand as they start looking around the market. They pass some stalls and Sei is interested in a jeweled hair accessory. Sadly, she cannot afford it, so Albert gives it to her as a gift after their time at the market. There are some gems in it that match the color of Albert's eyes. The next day, Johan asks Sei how their date went. Sei then realizes that she went on a date with Albert the previous day. According to Johan, Albert does not ask just any woman to join him on his trip to the market. A few weeks later, Erdhard, the chief mage, calls upon Sei to help with a spell. Apparently, the First Order of Knights has heard about Sei's magic and wants their own. The assembly cannot supply potions, so Sei has to go in and make them for the knights. By the end of the day, she has fulfilled several lucrative requirements and hopes to be finished by the next day. Erdhard evaluates the potions and is impressed by Sei's brilliant work. The rest of the assembly talk at great length about how the chief mage has never smiled before. As compensation, Sei requests to see a craftsman. She sees Albert and makes him some sweets, along with a pendant that has a jewel the color of her eyes to protect him from harm from magic. Albert kisses Sei's hand and out of embarrassment she turns her back to him. King Siegfried Slantania draws attention to Sei's achievements through her magic. Erdhard suggests that Sei is a saint, although this cannot be confirmed until the Grand Wizard awakens. Meanwhile, Sei delivers potions to the Third Order of Knights. They mention how in a month's time, the First and Second Orders of Knights will go to the forest together and how the First Order of Knights is taking things easy with their prince and Saint Era. After talking to the knights, Sei believes she may be a saint but refuses to tell anyone yet because she doesn't want it to be true. Sei is again kicked out of the lab for making too many potions. She goes to the library to learn about more types of magic and more powerful herbs. When Sei gets there, she remembers that books on these sort of subjects are usually in the Forbidden Collection. She finds a book on sacred affinity magic, but the spells are too advanced for her. The king himself comes and gives her a book for basic healing spells. Sei slowly realizes who he is and denies any reward she's offered. The king has to leave but assures her that she will be fairly rewarded at the court. After the joint operation between the First and Second Orders of Knights ends, Sei notices that several soldiers are seriously injured or missing limbs. One of them even talks about retiring because he can't go back to work. Sei works her magic on him and all the others, and heals everyone at once with an area heal spell. Johan and Albert are mesmerized by Sei's work. Later, Sei is informed that she is to be appraised by the Grand Magi Assembly. Sei is taken to Yuri Drew's, the Grand Magus, who has finally awakened. Accompanied by Johan, she meets him and is officially introduced to his second-in-command. Erdhard Yuri tries to appraise her but is unable to do so, but he notices the golden hue that her magic gives off when she performs a healing spell. Yuri believes this is either due to her otherworldly nature or something else. Sei has a good idea what it means though. Yuri speaks with the king privately, and while he cannot prove it, he is convinced that Sei is a saint. He also mentions Era's potential, because her magical powers are improving at a rapid rate. The king concludes that Prince Kyle's behavior cannot be overlooked anymore and orders Sei to be invited to palace for a formal apology. Sei is surprised by the invite and says that she hasn't got anything formal to wear to the court. After thinking it over, she accepts and is taken to the castle to get ready. The head maid, Marie, welcomes her and helps her out. Sei barely recognizes herself, and it's clear that those at the court see her as the saint. Albert Hawk escorts her to the throne room. At the court, the king formally apologizes to Sei for his son's behavior. Sei accepts the apology and asks to see the forbidden collection and to be given a tutor for magic as a recompense. The king agrees, and Sei later finds out that Yuri is to be her magic teacher. Meanwhile, Kyle hears the news but says everything is okay with the real saint. Yuri Drews makes his intentions clear about training Sei. He wants to study her magic by observing her. Erdhard is appalled by the idea but agrees to go with it. Sei finds the training difficult, but it's clear that she is lucky compared to the other people Yuri has trained. She visits Albert to tell him that she'll be taking her magic lessons during his drills. Albert agrees and tells Sei not to push herself during her training with Yuri. Albert announces that Sei will be joining their training as a healer, and she goes to sleep that night feeling very happy. 1 week later, Sei is invited for tea with a noble. Marie decides to call it a test of sorts for everything Sei has learned in her lady lessons. This noble turns out to be Elizabeth Ashley. During this time, it's noted that Elizabeth knows that Sei is the saint. She also talks about the other girl, Era, who was summoned and attended the Royal Magic Academy. Apparently, Era had been getting a lot of attention that had caused problems. However, this is not Era's fault, and Sei explains that in Japan, specifically in the 21st century, things are more socially relaxed, indirectly stating that women are allowed to show their legs and interact with men since there is no nobility and arranged marriages. One of Era's admirers was Prince Kyle, who happens to be Elizabeth's fiancé. She tries to apologize to Sei on her future husband's behalf, but Sei says it's not a big deal. They continue to drink their tea with Sei asking what life at the Royal Magic Academy is like. In a flashback, Era is about to leave her house after texting her mother when she's whisked away to another world. She's given the lowdown about Kingdom's situation by Kyle's attendant Damien, and realizes she'll never be able to return home. After she cries herself to sleep, Kyle vows to keep her safe. A few days later, Era tours the marketplace with Kyle and a few of his attendants. She notices how uptight everyone is about the prince. He explains how social norms are awkward, but vows to change this, and Era offers to help. She's given a maid's uniform and takes classes with the prince and his friends. Meanwhile, the other ladies look on in disgust. A few of them even confront Era about it but are chased off by Kyle. Meanwhile, Kyle learns that Sei may be the saint they've been looking for and gets frustrated, but decides to remain on course. The next morning, Elizabeth tries to talk with Era but is prevented by Kyle. The attendant then asks Elizabeth about the saint, and Elizabeth remarks that she's friends with the saint. Era goes to bed hoping to talk with Elizabeth properly the next time they meet. Back at the institute, Sei tries imbuing water itself with magic but to no avail. She remembers that holy water existed in video games in her world, so she asks Yuri about blessings. While Yuri hasn't heard of the concept, he finds it fascinating. He then mentions a spell known as the Saintly Conjury, one that has barely any information on how it's cast. However, it is known to purify miasma and destroy monsters born of it. Sei thinks this is a dead end and continues to try to bless plants late into the night. She finds out that plants do respond to holy magic. The herbs are used to make Sei's effective potions that can be made by anyone. Johan apologetically informs Sei that she's been called into the woods to help with the next expedition. Sei is slightly melancholic but agrees to go. Jude and Johan see her off as Albert goes to accompany her. Yuri also goes along, hoping to get more information on Sei's saintly conjury. As the Order of Knights sets up camp, Albert confesses about the enchantment, and that he's happy that she's wearing it. The expedition goes smoothly for the most part, but things pick up as the miasma grows denser. The Order of Knights finds a pack of wolves and a salamander protecting the miasma swamp. Their attack goes wrong and Albert is badly hurt. Sei tries to help him and activates her saintly conjury, purifying the area. Everyone is either happy or relieved that the expedition was a success. Yuri is elated following Sei's spell earlier that day. He begins asking her all sorts of questions, so Albert gets him to back off. Albert expresses his thanks to Sei. News of her exploits travels, and everyone looks at her with reverence. Johan ends up apologizing and hopes to make her life easier going forward. After one magic lesson, Sei overhears Prince Kyle arguing with Elizabeth about Era. Sei accidentally gets involved and Albert jumps to her defense. The king shows up to pull his son out of his disillusions. They move their conversation to a private room. To Sei's relief, Prince Kyle is sentenced to house arrest with his associates while Era continues to live as she wishes. Elizabeth sees through Kyle's plan to make himself a martyr, but Kyle denies it. He asks Elizabeth to take care of Era, and she agrees. Era eventually makes friends with both Sei and Elizabeth. King Siegfried then hears that the countryside is still ravaged by monsters and that Klossner's domain is the most desperate for the saints' help. Later, Sei is asked to accompany the Third Order of Knights to Klossner's domain in 2 weeks' time. She accepts, much to Albert and Johan's surprise. She tells them that the two of them put up with a lot to make her happy and silently thanks them for all they've done. Sei and Albert arrive in Klossner's domain and are met by the Lord himself. Sei relaxes after her journey wearing her casual garb provided by Marie. She thinks about how Klossner's domain is the alchemist's holy land and hopes to learn of potions that are stronger than high grade. Sei is impressed by the meal at dinner and notes that Klossner has adopted her cooking methods. Klossner also wants Sei to meet his esteemed herbalist, Corinna, and she agrees. After dinner, Albert says that he'll be taking a few days to survey the kingdom before they head off on their expedition. The following day, Sei meets Corinna and the latter is delighted to meet the saint. Sei helps learn to make potions and even meets a mercenary named Leonhardt. The next day she's allowed to look through the diary of the great alchemist. As a result, Sei learns that the great alchemist was a saint whose prayers for her little brother brought life back to the fields of Klossner's domain. The mercenary group returns with many injured warriors. They're happy to have Sei's potions, but Sei is worried for Albert. After healing the mercenaries, she finds Commander Hawk collapsed, surrounded by his men. Sei thinks the worst and her blessing activates. Albert is revealed to be fine, but Sei realizes something. The saint's true magic is that of love. Back in Klossner's domain, Sei practices with the saint's conjury. She gets it to work but gets embarrassed. Marie comes in with some afternoon tea. Sei notes how good Marie is at her job and she appreciates it since she doesn't think about it too much. Sei takes Marie's words to heart. When Sei goes to work, she asks Corinna for help with her blessing. Corinna has a servant set up several potted plants that haven't sprouted. Sei manages to perform the blessing but says it'll take a little while to see if it works. Corinna then asks her to bless several more potted plants and agrees they should check on them the following day. Leonhardt then comes by and asks Sei to join his mercenary company. Corinna mocks his rude behavior in making this request and Albert is also cross with him. Leonhardt realizes that Sei is the saint and is kicked in the shins for his reckless request. Albert decides to talk to Sei about their recent expeditions and Corinna takes Leonhardt aside so the pair can have some alone time. Albert sympathetically asks Sei for help since she's the only healer around. She agrees but thinks about her preparations to cast the blessing. Albert asks if she's okay, but she doesn't say anything to him yet. Back in the research lab, Johan has tea with Jude. They talk about what Sei is likely up to. Sei talks to Leonhardt about formality around her and about the expedition coming up. Later on, the expedition is ready to begin after Albert talks with the troops. He asks if Sei could speak to them to help him out, but she refuses. She gets into the carriage and Albert gives her a longing look. After trekking into the woods, Sei gets out of the carriage to stretch. She hopes to get to look at the herbs in Klossner's domain. Leonhardt greets Albert and Sei formally and Sei reminds him that it's okay for him to speak to them normally. As the knights travel through the woods, a slimy substance seeps nearby. Meanwhile, Leonhardt learns that Sei primarily works in the research institute and that she performs her saint duties on the side. After an awkward moment, Sei remarks how beautiful the forest is. Leonhardt says that it's only a forest but that he has spent a lot of time in forests. Sei tells him that the forests where she comes from aren't like those here and it is nice. Their nice moment is cut off when the knights announce that they have found some slimy digestive juice at the base of a tree. They note the lack of monsters, however, probably due to the fact Sei is there. They continue forward with caution as the slime trails them. After a while, some more appears and surrounds the group. The party begins fighting them off but are quickly outnumbered. Eventually, Yuri comes in with several fire tornadoes to kill off a bunch, with the help of Era and several mages. Sei successfully purifies the miasma swamp in the forest, learning how to best use her powers and even finding a few new uses for them, such as to regrow the entire woodland. Not only was it burned down in the first place because she got distracted from casting her spell, and Yuri had to step in and set fire to the whole forest. But it also feels like a natural progression from what Sei already knew she could do. Heal people, regrow limbs, and enhance herbs. All these things could easily apply to the plant life in the woods. Sei and the rest of the expedition team that was ambushed by the slime were able to retreat thanks to the sudden reinforcements led by Yuri and Era. After, Sei asks for Korina's help so she can train to use the saint's magic freely. The reorganized expedition team once again heads into the woods, but Leonhardt, who loved the forest where he grew up, is concerned because they are accompanied by Yuri, who was once known for raising an entire area during an expedition. The pair return to the kingdom with Yuri and his mages. At the end, Sei tells Albert what the secret of the saint's power is.